أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم نحمده ونصلي على رسوله الكريم وعلى عبده المسيح الموعود. We begin the proceedings for today's program with the recitation from the Holy Quran. And if I can request Dr. Ismail Muhammad Sahib to recite a portion from the Holy Quran with its English translation.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها لها ما كسبت وعليها ما اكتسبت ربنا لا تؤاخذنا إن نسينا أو أخطأنا ربنا ولا تحمل علينا إصرا كما حملته على الذين من قبلنا ربنا ولا تحملنا ما لا طاقة لنا به واعف عنا واغفر لنا وارحمنا أنت مولانا فانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. Allah burdens not any soul beyond its capacity. It shall have the reward it earns, and it shall get the punishment it incurs. Our Lord, do not punish us if we forget or fall into error. And our Lord, lay not on us a responsibility as though didst lay upon those before us. Our Lord, burden us not with what we have not the strength to bear, and efface our sins, and grant us forgiveness, and have mercy on us. Thou art our Master, so help us against the displeasing people. Jazakallah.
Jazakumullah, Dr. Sahib. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce our guest. Ahmad Salam Sahib is a career investment banker with 25 years of experience in debt capital markets and investment banking and founding director of the Islamic Bank of Britain. He developed an expertise in Islamic finance and was the founder of the first Western-approved Sharia bank, the Islamic Bank of Britain. He also happens, and this is a great fortune for him, that he also happens to be the son of world-renowned physicist and Nobel laureate in physics, Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib. And as we all know, Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib was the first Muslim and Pakistani to receive that award. When I was speaking with Ahmad Salam Sahib, we discussed about the fact how we often hear about the work carried out by Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib in his field of expertise. But I was eager to know more and learn more about him as an individual and his complete devotion to Allah the Almighty and the creation of Allah the Almighty. Assalamu alaikum, Ahmad Salam Sahib, and Jazakumullah for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu to everyone. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you so much for giving me the honor of addressing the audience today and everybody who's listening online. It's an absolute pleasure. As Marabi Saab mentioned, he and I sort of talked about what I should talk about in this talk. And I said, I'm not going to talk about my father's science, because that information is available very readily to anybody who's interested, and it's been explained many, many times over. But what has not been explained so well is perhaps his influences, his motivations, his inspiration, and some private aspects of his life. Now, many of you will probably have seen the documentary on Netflix, which was released last year. And if you haven't seen it, then I would urge you to watch it. It is a wonderful film. And just to be absolutely clear, whilst we as the family were involved in making the film, we did not have any influence whatsoever on the producer or the director or the scriptwriters. This was a completely independent production by two young Pakistani boys who had been following my father, the story of his life, for 14 years, and they actually took 14 years to make that film. And they both have full-time jobs, and so they were doing it in their spare time and collecting money and trying to raise money as they went along. And the money was needed for filming, to buy material from other film studios, etc. So that film, that short 75-minute film, took 14 years to make, which is quite an amazing statistic. And the boys continued making that film day and night. What's also interesting is that, sadly, whilst the original version was probably just over 90 minutes, the final version had to be cut down to 75 minutes because Netflix required it to be at 75 minutes to fit in with their programming scheduling. So I fully accept that in some cases, the film is a little bit disjointed. Perhaps it doesn't flow as well as we would like it to. But the reality is that the original version ran very well. And sadly, the Netflix version had a few changes to it. So, Murabi Saab, with your permission, I'll start.
Absolutely, please proceed.
So I suppose we have to start at the beginning in terms of who was the greatest single influence on my father. And that, without any doubt, was his father. And Jodi Muhammad Hussain Saab, my father's father, was a very devout Ahmadi, a very, very sincere, simple Ahmadi. He was a school inspector, so a very sort of middle income position. And my father, as all of you know, was one of 7 brothers and 2 sisters. He was the eldest of the brothers, and as I mentioned in the event on Thursday night, his father was told in 2 separate dreams that he was going to have a son. In the first dream, he was told to name him Abdul Salam, and in the second dream, he was shown this little boy climbing very high up a tree, and the boy kept going higher and higher and higher into the tree. And my grandfather, standing at the bottom, was getting very worried, and he kept shouting up to him to be very careful. And this little boy kept going higher. And finally, the boy turned around and shouted back down to my grandfather, "But don't worry, I'm absolutely fine up here. I know what I'm doing." And that, to my grandfather, was interpretation combined with the original dream that he had about having a son, that this son was going to be something special. And that set the tone of the relationship between my father and his father. And my father learnt his prayers, his discipline, his education, his guidance, and his support from his father. And this is a particularly important message to the fathers listening today. My grandfather would spend so much time with my father. Every day when my father came home from school, my grandfather would sit down with him. They would go over together what my father had learned at school today, and then they would prepare the next day's lesson. So my father was always ahead of the class. And that time that my grandfather gave my father was so important. And the fact that my grandfather put his other responsibilities to one side, obviously he had 9 children to look after together with my grandmother, but he focused his attention on my father and made sure that my father had the best possible start from an educational perspective as possible. The other person, of course, who I'd say had the second influence on my father was Joseph Khan Sahib. And that relationship began, as many of you know, back in 1946 when my father had won the scholarship to come to Cambridge University, and he had left Bombay, as it was then, Mumbai as it is now, on a boat, the Franconia, and he landed at Liverpool Dock. My grandfather, who knew Jodi Saab very well, had written to him to say that my father was coming. And Jodi Saab was actually at the port there to pick up his own nephew, and who happened to be on the same boat. So my father not ready for the winter of 1946, just had a small jacket and a great big trunk, which had his books and his possessions in it. And he was desperately trying to carry the trunk down the gangplank from the ship onto the harbour area. And Jodi Saab sort of guessed that this was Abdul Salam. So he went up and he helped my father. He took one end of the trunk and carried it to the train for my father. And that was the beginning of the most amazing relationship between Joseph-Ullah Khan Saab and my father. And I was very fortunate that my father always taught me that you should sit, as Islam teaches us, sit in the company of great men. And from a very early age, probably 6 or 7 years old, when my father was in London, when he was not traveling, every Sunday at 8:15, Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan Sahib would come round for breakfast at our house in Putney, the house I'm sitting in now, in fact. And I was made to sit for those 2 hours at every breakfast when Chaudhry Sahib and my father met. And of course, at the age of 6 and 7, even when I got to 10 or 11 years old, I didn't understand what they were talking about. But all I know is that my father would ask Chaudhry Sahib so many questions about religion and also about worldly affairs. And he would take Chaudhry Sahib's advice and guidance and listen very carefully and take notes of everything that Chaudhry Sahib told him. And that, I think, in many ways was probably the greatest single influence of another human being on my father. And I was very fortunate to sit, even as time went on, I became older, and I got to understand more of what my father was asking. And I want to explain this in the context of what I believe my father should be remembered for. The other person, again, who had a huge influence on my father was Mir Muzaffar Ahmad Saab, who was the Amir Jamaat of the USA. He was the grandson of the Promised Messiah, may Allah be pleased with him, and he was the number 2, I believe, in the World Bank. He was the executive director in the World Bank, which was a phenomenally senior position. And he had also served as the finance minister in Pakistan. So whenever Mir Muzaffar Ahmad Saab would come to London, we had the great good fortune that Masjid Fazl only had one small house at Melrose Avenue, was around the corner from Gresham Hall Road. And there were no facilities there for Mir Muzaffar Ahmad Saab to stay. So Mir Saab would stay again in this house, and we would put a bed on the ground floor for him, and he would sleep with us in the house. And that again gave me a wonderful opportunity to see Mir Saab again and his influence on my father. And then, of course, the influence of the Khulafa, the prayers of the Khulafa, and Hazrat Khalifah Masih III, may Allah have mercy on him, and Hazrat Khalifah Masih Rabi, Rahimullah, and the influence they had on my father. And on Thursday, I had read through very quickly, because the question is often asked is, what was your father's relationship with the Khulafa like? And in 1997, a year after my father passed away, the International Center for Theoretical Physics, which he had created in Italy, held a ceremony, and they hold it every year now to mark the anniversary of his death in November. And in 1997, it was a time when they had decided to change the name from the International Center for Theoretical Physics to the Abdul Salam International Center for Theoretical Physics. And they had asked all the family to come, so we as a family all went there, and they had asked us who should read messages or send messages from people in his life who he would have regarded as friends and important acquaintances and influences. And Hazrat Khalifah Masih Rabi Rahimullah wrote a piece which I'm going to read to you now, which I think essentially captures the love that happened and existed between Hazrat Khalifa Masih Rabi and my father. And I hope puts it into some sort of context for you, so you'll understand a little bit more about that mutual love and relationship between the two. So Hazur wrote, "In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the ever merciful, I take this opportunity to express my gratitude to the administrators of the ICTP and to the conveners of this conference, and to all the delegates who took time to come to pay tribute to the cherished memory of the late Professor Abdul Salam. I express my gratitude once again to the organizing body for providing me with a singular satisfaction of being associated with this auspicious occasion in the honor of a unique man of genius. I knew him from my childhood, but only in a way that a child would know of stars. There was nothing intimate and personal in our relationship, which began in earnest as late as 1978, during my holiday visit to North America and Europe. When he learned of my arrival in London with my wife and two elder daughters, he insisted I find time to visit his home. And perhaps he also had in mind the intimacy and love with which my late mother always treated his wife when she was a young student at Qadian, prior to the partition of India and Pakistan. His wife, Uncle Hafiz Begum, was even more keen for me and my family to spend a few leisurely hours at their home with their family. And when the ladies were busy chatting together in another room, Abdul Salam and I were closeted together in his personal room. And it was then for the first time that we developed a deep personal, intellectual, spiritual, and cordial relationship, which was to last until his death. His death left me mourning the departure of the most charming person whose interest was not confined to any single field of human inquiry. And during that time, I discovered him in the broadest perspective in which he deserved to be discovered. He knew religion, he understood the philosophy of cryptic Sufism, his knowledge of history was wide and profound. Theoretical physics was his subject, but that was not the only subject of which he had a masterly command. His profound knowledge of chemistry, biology, and the universe of subparticles was amazing. His intimacy with cosmology was no less surprising. But when it came to the vastness of nature and the oneness with the attributes of God, it was there that he outshone all other fields of intellectual pursuits. His theory of the unified field must have sprung from his total dedication to the unity of Allah. He had a firm belief that everything began with Allah and will end up with him. This might have motivated him to scientifically prove the hypothesis of the unification of the fundamental forces of nature. And during our discussions, he revealed to me he had already advanced his research to demonstrate the unity of two other fundamental forces. And had his life permitted, I am sure he would have received another Nobel Prize for his advanced work in this field. This short tribute to the memory of his genius is not meant to dwell upon his scientific achievements. I want to share with this august assembly today a few glimpses of Dr. Abdul Salam, a man who did not hesitate to discuss immense complexities of his advanced scientific knowledge with an uninitiated person like I was. He took pains to make me understand why the speed of light could not exceed 186,000 miles per second. I continue, however, to argue that under certain hypothetical conditions, the speed of light could be enhanced beyond this limitation. His tolerance with me during the course of the discussion, while I was a mere novice on the subject of theoretical physics, was a great tribute to his patience and grand-heartedness. At the end, however, he cautiously conceded that if, as I suggested, the properties of the medium which facilitates the maximum speed of light could be visualized to be different, the speed of light would correspondingly change, even transcending the present limitation. It was not his personal conviction, of course. His acceptance was conditional only to the big if involved. But he accepted my suggestion, realizing perhaps that the real implication of my suggestion was related to the limitless attributes of God. Among many questions I raised to quench my thirst for knowledge was one regarding the incomprehensible nature of heat radiation. It could travel at the speed of light as though riding its wings, yet it could also move so slowly as to take ages to reach the other end of a large room. If a fire is lit in one corner of a big hall, the people sitting in the other corner would hardly feel any heat emitted by the fire. This and many other intriguing questions were raised by me and answered by him in full earnest. To the question of heat radiation, he answered, as though in a confidential tone, that the one thing which even scientists fail to understand is the true nature of heat. And it was during this fascinating informal talk that I came to learn the vastness of Dr. Abdul Salam. And it was in that unique vastness that his genius lay. Ever since that meeting, we were never really separated again. He continued to seek my interview to help him resolve various problems which confronted him from time to time. And I never failed to make the best use of such meetings to enhance my personal knowledge. His philanthropist attitude was boundless. It was truly universal, without the least parochialism. No religious, political, ethnic, or nationalistic boundaries were charted on his purely human heart. The International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste has always paid and will always pay a standing ovation to the humanist in Abdul Salam. May Allah bless his soul in the hereafter, and may he also bless the noble objectives he pursued in the vastness of the material world he has left behind. So I hope that will give you some insight into the relationship between one of the Khulafa and my father. And what Khalifa Rabi there did, of course, was focus on one very important aspect. He didn't just focus on his science, but he focused on the humanity and the service of humanity that was so important to my father. And that is his most enduring legacy. His science, as I've said many times, would have been discovered by other people. Indeed, it was discovered by other people. If you think about it, the other two, Stephen Weinberg and Sheldon Glashow, his two co-Nobel laureates in 1979, won the prize for doing exactly the same work, but doing it independently. But what they did not do, and this is what Stephen Weinberg said in the film about my father, was his service of humanity and all the work he did to try and help humanity and work for humanity. As Khalifa Rabi said, without favor, without any regard for color, without any regard for background or whatever. He had one simple aim, that there was a huge divide between the developed world and the developing world. And people who just by accident of birth were born into the developing world, why should they have any lesser chance than anybody born in the developed world? And it was so important that people understood that that was the most important part of his life, trying to break down that barrier between the developed world and the developing world, and giving students from the developing world the best possible opportunity in life. And if you think about it now, the ICTP was established in 1964, and to this day, over 350,000 students have passed through the ICTP, purely because of the legacy of my father. And that, to my mind, is what he should be remembered for, not just for his scientific work. I'm very keen to make this as interactive as possible. So, Murabi Sahib, if there are any questions that you want to drop in, please feel free to just interrupt me.
Well, I think you've answered most of my questions anyway. But I think something I would really want to know is his humble beginnings in Jung. If you could tell us about his humble beginnings, where he came from, and how he progressed from that part of his life to what we came to know as, the great Dr. Abdul Salam.
Of course. Well, if you remember, in Jung, when my father was born, electricity had not reached Jung yet. So everything that he did, all his studies, were all done by candlelight. So his brothers would make candles, and he would study day and night by candlelight. And when he went to school and he was taught about electricity, that wonderful line from one of his teachers, who said, "We don't have electricity here in Jung. You have to go to Lahore to see electricity." And so just imagine that he lived by candlelight, he studied by candlelight, he did his homework by candlelight. And again, the family was so poor, they could not have any food, any meat more than once a month. So typically when my grandmother would make a meal and there were one or two scraps of meat in there, she would take the meat out for my father and made sure that he had the meat, because the view was that he needed to have the benefit of having protein from meat. So a very simple, very poor background. Of course, we all know the story of his scoring the highest number of marks at his matriculation, and then going on to even higher achievements throughout his academic life. And then there was an opportunity of a prize that was left over, a scholarship prize that was left over at the end of the Second World War, where there was a small amount of money which was given to students to go and carry on their education. And the boy who had actually won the scholarship was unable to take up his place. And my father was then, at a very short notice, was given the opportunity to come to Cambridge in 1946 and take up the scholarship at Cambridge. And it all began just as the war was ending. And he had to get from Lahore to Bombay very quickly in order to get on the ship to come to the UK. So he collected all his papers, his trunks and everything together as quickly as he could. And but he didn't have one particular document which is required. And when he got to the train station, he managed to get on the train, but then the army were checking his papers and he didn't have a particular paper that they required from him. And they thought that he was a deserter. But thankfully, he was able to convince them by showing them some of his books, etc., that he was not a deserter. Because again, if they had detained him and taken him off the train, then he would have missed the boat. He would not have got to Cambridge when he did. And of course, Cambridge was the beginning of his real exposure. But it's important to remember 1946 in Cambridge was one of the coldest winters on record in England. Nobody in England in 1946 knew very much about Islam. They certainly knew nothing about Ahmadiyyat. And so when my father got to Cambridge, he must have suffered tremendous, not a sort of a nasty prejudice, but just out of ignorance. People didn't know anything about his background. He didn't come from some wealthy English family. He was a simple peasant boy, very, very smart, very bright peasant boy, who had won a place to come to Cambridge. So you're aware of all the traditions of Cambridge University that goes back to its founding, and they still continue to this day. And if you didn't know, when you sat down at a meal at Cambridge, you have all these knives and forks, and you have to work out which knife and fork to use for each course of the meal. Of course, my father didn't know any of this. And so for him, the experience of being at Cambridge must have been incredibly difficult. And of course, in those days, just after the war, there was no question of halal food. So, and there was very little meat that he could eat. So he lived off macaroni cheese as the only thing he could eat. For 2 years, between 1946 and 1948, he lived literally off a diet of macaroni cheese. So that gives you a little bit of background into his very simple beginnings.
Dr. Saab, if I can take you to when he won the Nobel Prize and he became a world-renowned figure in the Islamic world as well as the science world. So I was thinking, Dr. Saab, Ahmad Saab, when we see the pictures of him receiving the award, and we discussed about this in the program last week, how he wore the traditional Pakistani clothing, the fact that he never gave up his Pakistani passport despite having been given the offer of residing in many countries, multiple countries in the world. There's one question that does come to mind, that despite the fact that many current governments undermine the work of the earlier Ahmadis who were part of the making of Pakistan, including Dr. Abdul Salam, What was his relationship like with the governments of Pakistan in the 60s and perhaps early 70s?
Well, of course, that's a very good question. People assume that, let me tell you one very interesting fact. So, if I was live in front of an audience, I would ask people, who was it who introduced Professor Abdul Salam to General Ayub Khan, who's then the president of Pakistan? Because Ayub Khan had not heard of Abdul Salam. But in 1961, I think it was, Ayub Khan came to England on an official tour. And he happened to be having lunch with Her Majesty the Queen and Prince Philip. Prince Philip was the Chancellor of Cambridge University. And over that lunch, because my father, of course, had studied at Cambridge University, Prince Philip knew of my father. And Prince Philip mentioned to General Ayub Khan, you have a most brilliant scientist in this man of the Salam. You should find a use for him back in your countries, because you're clearly on a road of development and you're trying to achieve things in Pakistan. And that was where Ayub Khan first had an introduction to my father. And again, the relationship between Ayub Khan and my father was very close. I was very fortunate on one occasion. My father just told me to get up one Sunday morning and get dressed, but put something nice on. And the Pakistan High Commission had sent their car, and it's a lovely big black car, a Humber it was in those days. And I got into the back of the car with my father, and we drove down to Surrey. And I don't know which hotel it was. And we went into the hotel, and there was General Ayub Khan. And I was witness to General Ayub Khan sitting with my father and talking to my father. And the wonderful relationship between them. And what's important to remember is that my father was the chief scientific advisor, not the chief physics advisor, scientific advisor. So again, because of the God-given gift of my father's intellect and his breadth of his knowledge, he was able to look at a whole number of programs in Pakistan relating to education, science and technology, and of course, one of the other very important bits that my father worked on was the agricultural system in Pakistan, specifically with regards to irrigation. So he wrote the master plan for the irrigation of Pakistan. And if you think Pakistan now is very much an agricultural economy, and it relies heavily on the irrigation system that was put into place in the 1960s by my father, very little has been done to update it, and it has remained to this day an incredibly advanced and reliable system. So throughout Ayub Khan's time, and even into General Yahya Khan's time, the relationship between my father and Pakistan was extremely close. Pakistan would do everything to support my father that it could. And it was only, of course, when Prime Minister Bhutto lost his way and fell foul of certain influences that the relationship broke down. And by the time, of course, General Zia had come to office, it was very difficult to maintain any kind of relationship. But the very important point I want to make very clearly was the chairman of the International Atomic, the Pakistan Atomic Energy Agency of Pakistan was a gentleman called Munir Khan. He had been put into that role by my father, as indeed all the scientists of Pakistan have been put into their roles by my father. They could never invite my father to Pakistan, but they would always call him and phone him and write to him, asking for advice, asking for guidance, asking how to deal with issues. And never once did my father never respond to them and do whatever he could behind the scenes, under the radar screen, never having his name in any public domain, but he continued to advise and guide them right the way until his very last breath. And he never lost that love for Pakistan and never lost that relationship with the people of Pakistan, and to do whatever he could for the people of Pakistan. It didn't matter to him really what the politicians did and what games they played and how they tried to undermine, or what the mullahs did. He would continue to do whatever he could for the benefit of the people of Pakistan. I hope that gives.
That's perfect. Jazakumullah, Ahmad Sahib. Before I ask you the next question, if there are any questions, please put them in the live chat. And I was speaking to Ahmad Sahib. He said he wants questions from young children as well, in terms of what Dr. Saab liked and what his preferences were. So if there are any children watching, if they want to put down any questions in the live chat, that will be very helpful. Dr. Saab, there's a question on the screen. Perhaps.
Yep. I can see from Nazim Jamal Saab. Most scientists become atheists as their scientific knowledge increases. What made your father become more convinced of the existence of God? And excellent question. I guess one of the questions I'm often asked is which chapter of the Holy Quran did your father feel was his core inspiration? And it was from Surah Al-Mulk, chapter 67, verses 2 to 5. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, bismillahir rahmanir rahim. It says, the verse I want to give you was, He is the mighty, the most forgiving, who has created the seven heavens in order, one above the other. Thou cannot discover a flaw in the creation of the Gracious One. Then look again. See thou any disparity? Look again and yet again. Thy sight will return to thee frustrated and fatigued. And if there is one verse that inspired my father about his work about the unity, that there was always a greater force, a greater being, there was a greater builder of everything. And that verse gave him the inspiration that keep looking, keep looking, keep looking, and believe in the unity of Allah and the oneness of Allah. And that should be the basis of what your theory should be based around. And that's exactly what he carried on in his work, and that understanding. So it came from his basic teaching from his father, his complete belief in Islam, the oneness of Allah, the Holy Quran, and all the teachings in Islam, and also the history of Islam. He was immensely proud of all the great developments and the great teachers and the great scholars who have been absolute world leaders. And when when my uncle or my mother would drive my father to Imperial College, and I could go along as well, he would often sit in the car with me and explain to me about all the great scholars and all the great Muslim intellects. And he took great pride in them, and they were also part of his inspiration as to why he believed in Allah and the unity as indicated by Allah. So it seems I hope that answers your question.
Ahmad Sahib, you remember when we spoke over the phone, you mentioned about his humanitarian services, especially to help the poor in Pakistan, the students in Pakistan. What else is there that you would like to mention in terms of his humanitarian services?
Yeah, I'm glad you reminded me of that, because I think there's a number of things that he taught me, and this is something I'd love to give as an example to the children, is his humanitarian services. Every single prize my father ever won tended to have a money prize with it as well. He never kept a single cent for himself. So even with the Nobel money, that was in those days, a reasonable amount of money. But of course, now, if you win the Nobel Prize now, you get $1 million. In those days, 1979, it was $30,000. He wanted to set up a charity in the name of his parents, specifically to fund education for the least privileged but the brightest children in Pakistan. So that charity, called the Muhammad Hussain Hajra Hussain Nobel Talent Fund, was set up in 1981, I believe. It's a UK charity. And alhamdulillah, we still run it today in a very small way. It's a very small charity. But we do give grants to as many young children from Pakistan and actually across the developing world as we can, so that they can continue their education. And then he set up the Dirac Prize, which is given by the Institute in Italy. He set up a number of other prizes in the name of other great physicists who inspired him, where he gave monetary prizes, again, from the winnings of all the prizes that he won to carry on that work. So that was the sort of financial side. The other side I remember was, if he ever met a young student from Pakistan, he would go out of his way to try and help them, whether they were Andy or not. It didn't matter. If they needed a letter of reference, and he didn't particularly know them, he would write them a letter of reference that they could take to a university or to an academic somewhere. And inevitably, because it was a handwritten letter from Abdul Salam, it would carry a certain amount of weight. And so he would give that student that letter, and they would go and try and make the most of it. Of course, if it was an Andy student who came to him, he would do whatever he can to try and help that student, whether it was picking up the phone and calling professors to try and make sure that the student got the best possible opportunities, the best possible openings, etc., etc. And so that spirit of serving humanity and understanding that he had the ability to help people and help people in any way that he could was absolutely paramount in his life. And combine that with his simplicity, his humility, and his very, very careful guarding of time, which again was a lesson that he learned from his father, that one should not waste a second of time. There was no concept of holidays for him. He never took a day's break. He would always work wherever he was, whether he was in the car, whether he was on an airplane, whether he was on a train. And these are the days before computers, when he'd have a notebook and he'd just make notes and do all his work. We, as his children, my sisters and myself, had to suffer the same issues. So when we would go and see him in Italy, he would arrange for one of his students to then, and we thought we were going on holiday. So the typical summer holidays, July, August, we think, great, we're going to Trieste for a few days, a few weeks to have a holiday. Nothing like that. We would go, and then I would be told specifically, so one of his students would be told, right, you're going to teach my son physics, and you're going to teach my son math. So every day, I would have to go down to the center and have a few hours of tuition. And even when I was at school, in those days, we used to have Saturday school, Saturday morning. When Saturday's school finished, I would have to get on the bus and go to Imperial College, and I would sit with one of his students there to teach me more maths and more physics and more science. So the concept of rest was not in his life. So that was his absolute focus on hard work and putting the hours in and teaching me there is no substitute for putting in hard, long hours. He would get up every morning, 3 o'clock, offer his tahajjud, offer his fajr namaz, and then by 4 o'clock, he would typically start working. The night before, we would put a thermos flask of hot tea, some biscuits, some cheese, and some nuts by his bed. And when he woke up, he could continue to work and have a snack and have his breakfast. So then he would work, and for him, that was his most creative time. He loved being up, working from between, say, 4:30 and 7:30, 3 hours, uninterrupted work. And then he would shower, breakfast. If he was in London, he would go to the college, and he'd come back at 6 o'clock in the evening. And this is a point I made again on our call the other day. When he was in London, we as a family, all of us, he would not eat until we were all seated around the table. My sisters and myself, my mother, would all sit around the table, and he would go around the table asking my sisters and myself, each of us, what have you done at school today? What have you learnt? What are you struggling with? What are you good at? And every day we would have to go through this with him. And he took such interest in our education, which again is a lesson for the parents of today. Don't let your children just drift along by themselves. Take an interest in them. Take time to understand what they're doing, what they're enjoying, what they're not enjoying, what they're having difficulty with, and try and help them and encourage them. So that was his hard work. And last point, his humility. I'll just make that point, which I always make this point because I think it is important, that he would give time to everybody and anybody, as much time as they needed. And he would show immense respect to people, irrespective of their status. So it didn't matter whether you were a king or you were the most simple person out there. And I remember one job that I always had to do, that when my father would travel, quite often the Pakistan High Commission in those days, when he was still the scientific advisor, would send a car to take him to the airport. And the driver, whose name I still remember, Khan, who's a Pathan driver, would sit outside. And he's very respectful of my father. So he'd come early, make sure he wasn't late, because my father was very, very jealous about guarding his time. And I would always have, so my father would always make sure I took Khan out some food and a cup of tea. And when my father came back from a long journey, and remember, my father only ever flew in economy. He never flew until he was ill later in life, anything else other than economy. He would say to people, don't send me a first class or a business class ticket. Keep that money, educate more children, and send me an economy ticket. So he'd fly back, the car would pick him up, we would say salam to him, and then my first job was to make sure the driver always got some food and some tea. And then to come back and tell my father that you can now have a cup of tea or have some dinner or whatever it is, because I've given the driver his food first. And that was typical of my father. Make sure that everyone is taken care of, and not look after himself until everyone else is taken care of. So I think you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
I can, yes.
So I've received a question from Sajid Rai Sahib. He writes that in Italy, the institution, which was led by Dr. Sahib, is still offering services to students now?
Absolutely. So it's now even bigger than before, and it's still
Mashallah.
very active, and it's even more influential now than it's ever been in its history. And so much so that there is now a institute in Venezuela, an institute in Mexico, an institute in Vietnam, and they're opening an equivalent one in China. And in India, there is a International Center for Theoretical Sciences, not theoretical physics, but theoretical sciences. And that was started by one of his Indian students. And that is open to all those institutions are open to every student from the developing world. There is no preference for anyone. You can be Nigerian, Ghanaian, Syrian, Pakistani, Indian, Sri Lankan, Bangladeshi. It doesn't matter. You are there purely and totally because of your intellectual capability.
I think the second part of that question was how many Pakistani students have benefited from that institution? Do you have any idea in terms of numbers?
I think it's probably available on the ICTP website. They have a breakdown of the nationalities. So rather than me giving you an incorrect number, best to look at it from the actual source.
We have a question from Myra Mahmood Sahiba. She writes that my question is, what was Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib's best quality?
Wow. His love of humanity, his service of humanity. That's what it was. His name, as you know, means servant of peace. And he lived up to that name in every sense, as a servant of peace and prosperity and trying to make the world a better place. That struggle continued throughout his life. And when the piece I read from Khalifa Rabi and the guidance he got from Josephullah Khan Sahib and the guidance he got from Mir Muzaffar Ahmad Sahib was all about how to manage certain situations, how to manage political leaders around the world to get what he wanted, to get a budget for education, for science and technology, to make their economies grow better, to make the economies grow faster and stronger, and therefore to help the people in those developing countries. So that's in essence what his life was all about.
Jazakumullah. There was another question here, Ahmad Sahib. Let me just find that one for you. Can we touch on his relationship with Sir Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan Sahib? You mentioned a few sittings they had, and perhaps you were 11 years old at that time. Can you shed more light upon that relationship? Because these two were perhaps two of the most influential figures in the Jamaat.
Absolutely. And of course, Jyoti Sahib was older than my father, but as I said, that relationship began really in 1946. And it was an incredibly strong bond between Professor Salam, my father, and Jyoti Sahib. And I'm just trying to remember, there's one particular story where at one of the breakfasts, my father had suggested to Jyoti Sahib that we needed a book about the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, and his life at home as a role model for the younger generation to read. And I think Jyoti Sahib, if I recall, had written something in Urdu as a rough sort of transcript. And my father had said that he would be very happy to have it translated and printed, etc. And that, so my father then went away for a few weeks. He came back about 3 weeks later, sat down again with Jyoti Sahib over this breakfast. And Jyoti Sahib took out the manuscript and gave it to my father and said, "Here it is." And that book, of course, is now called The Prophet at Home. I'm not sure it's in print any longer, but if you look in the front of it, it's dedicated to my father. And Jyoti Sahib says that I've got the book behind me, but rather than getting it now, it was inspired by Abdul Salam to write this book as a guide for the younger generation in particular. So that was one example of the sort of relationship. As I just alluded to, a lot of my father's work involved negotiations and discussions with world leaders to get his point over about the need to raise money for science and education. The person who taught him how to deal with those world leaders, how to position his argument, how to position himself, was Chaudhry Sahib. And that was so important in my father's success of what he achieved, knowing how to handle all these world dignitaries, so presidents, prime ministers, kings. As he went around the world, he would ask Chaudhry Sahib, I'm meeting King Hussein of Jordan, for example. And of course, King Hussein was a huge friend of Joseph-Ullah Khan Sahib. And my father said, how should I handle him? And how should I deal with this particular issue of science and technology in Jordan? And Chaudhry Sahib was able to give my father a great deal of insight and advice as to how to manage that relationship. And King Hussein of Jordan became one of my father's greatest supporters in the Arab world. And he's one of the few Muslims of the world who consistently stood up for my father. The Saudis, I mean, it's of course, it's ironic that after he won the prize in 1979, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia sent a message of congratulations to my father on behalf of the Muslim Ummah, but they could never invite him back into Saudi Arabia. The Bahrainis followed the Saudis. The Emiratis were not particularly interested in education. The Omanis and the Sultan of Oman was extremely supportive of my father. But the one Gulf Arab leader who was very supportive of my father, and the country still continues to support my father's institute to this day, is Kuwait. Because the Kuwaitis were the most educated of all the Gulf Arabs. And the Emir of Kuwait invited my father to Kuwait a number of times and treated him with great respect and gave him not only the respect, but also the financial support to continue his work. And knowing how to handle those people, that guidance came from Chaudhry Sahib firstly, and Mir Muzaffar Ahmad Sahib secondly. So I hope that answers the question.
Ahmad Sahib, what can you tell us about his love and affiliation with the Holy Quran?
Of course, it's so he would have the Holy Quran constantly playing in the background. So before, now people are used to MP4 players and all the various devices. Your phone, you can hear the music on. In those days, cassette tapes had not yet been invented. You had the vinyl records. So my father would have a huge set and a variety of qaris who'd recite the Holy Quran. And his most favorite was Abdul, who's an Egyptian qari. And my father would always have his record on in the background in his room. So I've said it on many occasions, everyone is very welcome to come and visit the house, come and see the room. And we still have his record player, which still has all the records with it. And the room would always be very hot because my father felt the cold and he always loved to be warm. There was always a strong agarbatti, incense stick in the room. So it's a very heavily scented room, a hot room, and the Quran Majid would always be playing in the background, always lightly playing in the background. And he was one of the first people I know. When he went to Tokyo, he bought a portable cassette player. I can't remember what they're called now, but they had a small headphone. So it means he could then have the cassettes of the Holy Quran. And when he was traveling, he would always have that with him in his pocket with his headphones on, listening again and getting his inspiration from the word of Allah. And so it was such an important part of his life that he had it with him the whole time. He had a mini, tiny Holy Quran, and he would always keep it in his top pocket of his jacket. And he would always look at it and read it and get the inspiration as many times in a day as he could.
Ahmad Sahib, I would pose one more question to you, then we can finish the session for today. So my question to you would be that, in this day and age, we have families who are disrupted by the media, social media, and all these things which are happening around the world. I mean, Dr. Saab lived in simpler times. How was he able to engage with you as a family and inspire you as a family to grow? MashaAllah, you have had such a successful career yourself. What can you say in the words of Dr. Abdul Salam to inspire the next generations?
I think I had put out some quotations which I thought might be of interest to people. Scientific thought is a common heritage of mankind, which of course is one of his most famous ones. Time cannot be a stream upon whose banks we can sit and watch its flowing. Time is our most precious commodity, and each moment must be highly valued and accounted for. In one of his speeches about the Holy Quran and science from the paper Islam and Science, he said, 750 verses of the Holy Quran, almost 1/8 of the book, exhort believers to study nature and to reflect and to make the best use of reason in their search for the ultimate and to make the acquiring of knowledge and scientific comprehension part of the community's life. And he went on to say in that same speech, believe me, there are high creators of science amongst us and potentially among our youth. They have the strongest urge to join in the adventure of knowing and finding knowledge. Trust them. Their Islam is as deeply founded. Their appreciation of the spiritual values of the Holy Book are as profound as anyone else's. Provide them with the facilities to create science and its limitations from the inside. There is truly no disconsonance between Islam and modern science. And in that quote, trust the youth. Their Islam is deeply founded as anyone's. Their appreciation of the spiritual values of the Holy Book are as profound as anyone else's. And that was the essence of the relationship. Trust the youth to guide them, help them, but let them go their own way and trust them. And that was, I guess, the sort of inspiration of the core of our relationship as the children of Abdul Salam.
Ahmad Saab, that brings us to an end for today's program. It's been such an honor and privilege to have you with us today, and you've really shown us another dimension to Dr. Abdul Salam Sahab's life. And I've been inspired. I'm sure people at home have also been inspired by Dr. Abdul Salam Sahab's life and his achievements and his services to humanitarian work. And the fact that till this day, poor children and students can they can achieve similar heights, treading on the same ways of Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib is hugely inspiring. May Allah Ta'ala elevate the status of Dr. Abdul Salam Sahib and enable our next generation to follow in his footsteps. Ahmad Sahib, Jazakumullah Asl Jaza for being with us. May Allah Ta'ala bless you in every way, and inshallah we will see you soon.
Inshallah. Jazakallah, and thank you so much for inviting me.
And Jazakumullah to all the viewers as well for tuning in. Inshallah we'll see you again with another session in the future. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.